I'm Dennis Jers. I'm teaching an American literature class at Seton Hill University, and I want to offer a really quick overview of what was happening in America at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, so that we can understand literature that from that time period that responds to and engages with the experiences that people of that time period felt were worth telling each other. Now, this is a picture of the black population in the United States in the early 21st century. The darker regions have a greater percentage of black people. And now this is a satellite image showing farmland. Now, see that crescent shape? 100 or 65 or so million years ago, this was a coastline, and lots of fossils piled up here along the water's edge. And millions of years later, those fossils are nutrients in the soil. And though of course, farmers back then, of course, they didn't have the satellite image. They couldn't see this from orbit. But this is where, when they planted crops, those crops really thrived. And in the early 1800s, this crescent area shows where farmers planted cotton. Of course, they planted other crops, but this is where cotton particularly thrived. This close-up of Alabama shows part of this same, fertile crescent, and you can see how it runs through counties that voted blue. This is just one example of how the land affects culture in America. Our relationship to the land affects the way we live. It affects the beliefs that we hold, the values that we base our lives upon, and the stories that we tell about ourselves. Now, as you probably know, 30,000 or so years ago, people migrated to the continent that we know as America. They migrated from Asia across a land bridge from what we know of as Siberia to Alaska, and they settled in the land around here. Rising waters submerged that land bridge about 15,000 years ago, but the indigenous peoples of America developed their own cultures and civilization, languages, tribes, and so forth. Now, after about the year 1000 or so, there were a couple visits from Vikings, but Columbus in 1492 starts the flow of Europeans, first as visitors and explorers. In 1607, in Virginia, Jamestown is the first permanent European settlement. And 1607, that's during the lifetime of William Shakespeare, and it's a few years around there. Galileo is going to first look through a telescope and see the moons of Jupiter. So anyway, well, if you were awake at any point in school in America, you would have learned the date 1620 when the Pilgrims arrive. They were religious fugitives, Protestants who were persecuted by other Protestants in England, and their religious sense of purpose that God brought them here to America is a huge part of the American founding mythology. And as a literature professor, I spent a lot of time engaging with and asking students to think about that founding mythology and how it relates to the American obsession with individualism and freedom. So 1620 is a very important date for Americans. But if we want to understand America, we should also know the date 1619. That is when a Dutch ship with some 20-odd Africans sailed into America. Those Africans were not passengers, they were cargo. Some of these Africans were traded for food at this port. Now, they were not technically sold as property. They were prisoners of war, and they were contracted out as indentured servants. This was a common practice at that time in Europe, where people, usually people who were in debt, contracted themselves to work for a set period of time for no pay. And after they did that set of time, they were considered to have paid off their debt and they could expect to be free. This system of indentured servitude was something that white Europeans had developed and worked out amongst themselves. And records indicate that some of these kidnapped Africans did, in fact, gain their freedom after they served their time. So there's some debate over whether it's accurate to say the enslavement of Americans in Africa started in 1619. But the point is, we do have a record of the first Africans being forced into servitude in 1619, just before the Pilgrims arrived in the colonies seeking freedom. So that's a tension there. Now, in addition to the native peoples who, of course, have been here for thousands of years, we have this influx of English settlers establishing their presence along the East Coast, and the Spanish in the Southwest, and the French in Louisiana and up the Mississippi River to the Midwest. And here, I'm speaking from about an hour outside of Pittsburgh. If you went to school in this area, you doubtless would have learned about how disputes around the Pittsburgh area between the English and the Colonials and the French erupted and led to what we know around here as the French and Indian War in 1754. That's what Americans call this war, which other parts of the world consider this squabble between the French and the Indians on one side and the American colonials and the British Empire on the other side. That was part of a much larger war that started in Pittsburgh, but it ended up flaring up wherever Great Britain and France sort of competed with and shared interests in many parts of the world. And when it was all over, the French had retreated from America, and the colonials seemed to be a lot better off having more access to territory that the French had claimed earlier. And Great Britain decided, well, the colonials had benefited so much from this war, and which was very expensive for Britain to undertake. The British decided that they would tax the colonials to pay them back for the war. And this leads to eventually to the Boston Tea Party and the Revolutionary War, with the American colonials complaining that they were taxed to meet the needs of the British Empire, but the American colonials were not represented in Parliament, so they had no voice in the government debates that led to the taxation. So this is all just a very quick reminder of what role the Pittsburgh area played in global events. And of course, one of the players in the area at the time fighting on the side of the British was a young George Washington. The Declaration of Independence in 1776, of course, we fast forward then to the War of 1812, which we can think of as England making a move to take back these rogue colonies, and they very nearly succeed. But the fact that these, this scrappy bunch of rebels managed to defeat a global empire is a big part of America's founding myth. And it's a kind of a promise to Americans that this crazy experiment in democracy wasn't just a blip in history, but rather it was it was their big step toward prominence on the world stage. Now, for all that grandiose language, really, until the 20th century, most Americans lived in rural areas rather than cities. And most Americans in the early 1800s were farmers, and most farmers worked their own small family plot and spent most of their time growing a food crop like corn, mostly just to keep their family from starving. If they had, they would feed their animals, livestock and so forth. And if they had any extra, they'd sell it in the nearest town, and they would buy the few things they couldn't make themselves. But even in the cities, there would be horses pulling carts and live chickens and animals everywhere and so forth. So the idea is that most Americans throughout most of America's history have this really deep connection to the land because we were an agrarian economy. Now, if you were a farmer and your soil was especially rich, you might be able to grow all the food you needed in a smaller space, and you could risk devoting some of your land and some of your time to producing a cash crop like cotton. You can't eat cotton, of course, so you had to make sure that your food crop grew first. But if you did manage to grow some cotton along with your food, you could sell it for cash because factories needed cotton. to make things for people to buy in stores. And as the towns grew, the towns needed carpenters and lamplighters and street sweepers and night watchmen and, people running general stores and factory workers. And these are jobs for town people. And the more, people that were living in towns, the more market there was for the raw materials that factories in those towns used to make things for those townspeople to buy. So, you start getting a feedback loop here. I don't have the time right now to go into the whole economics of cotton, but I think the thing to know about it is it's very labor intensive. A single farming family that's working hard, sun up to sundown to grow the food they need to live on. Well, the farm family can hunt and gather and fish and whatnot to supplement what they grow. But in an agrarian economy, it just doesn't make sense for a farm family to plant a lot more that they can eat because farming is hard work. And if you're not sure that you're going to have the time to cultivate and harvest and process crops that you can't eat, it's risky to do that extra work of planting it. But cotton was big money to those people who could afford to gamble by committing extra labor to it. Now, of course, the key is here, it's not their own labor that they're committing. It's the labor of people that they enslaved. Plantation owners used slaves to clear the land from the native vegetation to make room to plant cotton. And after, 5, 10, 15 years, the land would be exhausted of nutrients. And so the landowners would then have to clear more land. And finding good soil for cotton was actually a big force in westward expansion. But in the spring, the slaves would plant the cotton, and during the summer they would tend the plants, and in the fall, when the cotton flowers were producing these seed-bearing husks that contain the cotton fibers that are so valuable, all the slaves, and this is men, women, children, old people, everybody dropped what they were doing and went out into the fields to do this exhausting work in the hot sun, picking cotton by hand, and they're slave drivers with whips lashing workers who weren't working fast enough. So the more slaves that you owned, the more cotton you could pick and the more money you could make. And the invention of the cotton gin greatly increased the productivity of the slaves, but the cotton gin didn't make lives for slaves any easier. I mean, once you had, if you put your money in a cotton gin, the more cotton gins you owned, the more cotton you could process, and so the faster you wanted it picked, and the more slaves that you bought so they could pick the cotton for you. And slaves were valuable to this economic process. And when I mention that slaves were valuable, I should also point out that one way a plantation owner could make money was by breeding slaves and selling the slaves. Historian Stephen Dale estimates that in 1860, the value of slaves was roughly 3 times greater than the total amount of animal stocks in the South. 7 times greater than the total amount of money invested in banks. 12 times greater than the value of the nation's entire cotton crop in a given year. And get this, 48 times the entire federal budget expenditure for that year, 1860. So this huge amount of value of money and wealth tied up in the bodies of enslaved Africans really drove the Southern economy. And a piece of paper that President Abraham Lincoln signed in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, threatened these rich plantation owners with economic ruin, which heralded the collapse of the Southern economy. Now, as I said before, most white Southerners were too poor to own even one slave. And many of these Southerners would have participated in the economy created by the labor of enslaved Africans. They would have been, making dresses for the wives of the plantation owners and tutoring their children and making furniture and carriages and selling them their books and working as their lawyers and their doctors and their clerks. And if the plantation economy collapses, even though the number of plantation owners was relatively small, their wealth and the economy that they supported was really a huge driving factor in Southern culture. Now, I've known people from the Deep South, friends of mine, who confidently state that the real cause of the Civil War was the federal government's infringement upon the rights of the states. It's not about slavery, it's about states' rights. Now, of course, the states' rights supporters kind of conveniently leave out the fact that in the years leading up to the Civil War, the secession of the southern states and the war that followed, the issue that they seceded over was the right of the states to legalize slavery. That's what they squabbled about. That's what they complained about, and that's why they left the Union. Other issues, taxation and industrialization and trade agreements and so forth, all of those pretty much are turn out to be another way of exploring how the plantation class completely depended upon the exploitation of enslaved people. And once those slaves could no longer uphold the system that the federal government determined was illegal, the economy of the South starts falling apart. Now, the U.S. Civil War was a long and bloody battle, made even bloodier by recent advances in military technology and by generals who still clung to strategies that were designed generations ago for men on horses, that did not translate well to a more modern era where you had rifles that were accurate at much greater distances. At any rate, by the end of the Civil War, in the South, almost 1 in 5 white men are dead. And in the North, it was about 1 in 20, so still a huge number. Now, I'm only touching very broadly on this, but I just want to sort of, place you in a world that would have been familiar to people 100, 150, 200 years ago. These details that you might be absorbing as dry statistics would have been just part of the fabric of life for people back then. Just like masks and social distancing, when you tell people of your grandchildren's generation about masks and social distancing, to them it'll, I hope anyway, it'll just be a sort of a story that they hear about. But understanding American literature really means understanding the world that the characters lived in, and the world that the authors lived in, and the first readers of these literary works lived in. The growing season in the North, of course, is shorter than in the South, and so the Northern economy couldn't depend upon growing crops so much. The Southern farms then would grow the raw materials that in the North, with their access to rivers and coal mines and so forth, the Northern factories would turn the agrarian products into manufactured goods to sell to Europe and to sell back to the Southern plantation class. But when you had factories in the South and farms in the North too, it's not that there were it's not like a binary opposition between the North and the South. But with the Civil War, the South really overnight lost its greatest investment, which is the bodies of the enslaved workers. And the Northern factories were perfectly happy to absorb that new source of labor. Let's look again at this map of fertile soil in the South and the black population in the South. Many of the descendants of Africans forced to work on the cotton plantations ended up staying in that area after slavery ended. Or they were working as farmhands. Maybe if they were skilled, they'd have a skill like blacksmithing in the towns, or maybe they'd have a small plot of land of their own. It wasn't like the owners didn't give them part of the land that they had worked on. But remember, at this time, the average American was a farmer, and the white farmers still needed workers. The former slaves might have gotten, work as farmhands. They'd get room and board, maybe a tiny bit of wage, or sharecroppers that would work a small plot of land owned by somebody else and turn a share of their crop over to the owners. Uh, uh, the map shows where former plantation slaves stayed, but it also shows where they went. And many of them went north to work in factory jobs. And the northern cities are very populous, but they don't register on this particular map, which shows the percentage of blacks, because even though a lot of blacks moved to those northern cities, proportionately, a large number of European immigrants, white immigrants, also moved there from Ireland or Italy or Poland in search of the factory jobs that would give them the American dream. So in America, the 20th century brings class tension as the sort of the innovators and the risk takers and the educated and landowners open up new economies and markets, and they did brilliant, amazing things that helped. The industrialists in America helped make America an international global power. But the sheer number of uneducated workers looking for work, even though their work was important to the economy, after these folks might have left their small family farms, in the South or even in Europe, it meant that factory owners can pay peanuts for the labor of these workers. And, for workers of any race, working in the mills was often little better than slavery. I mean, a slave owner at least has an economic incentive not to starve or to kill the slaves that he's paid for. But a factory owner has no incentive to care for individual workers. If they get killed in the mines, he can just hire more people tomorrow. So as the 20th century progresses, you have more men working in factories far away from home, instead of working on their own land, or maybe they worked alongside their family members. And that leads to questions about the changing role of fatherhood, because the fathers were no longer working side by side with their other family members. The women often still worked in the home alongside the girls, but the boys didn't have their fathers around because the boys didn't see their fathers working. Anyway, so the labor movement, as it gains steam, we see the rise of office culture, where you have a sort of a middle class of office workers and shop clerks and this underclass of elevator operators and shoe shine boys and taxi drivers. And the desires of the sort of restless and ambitious people who want to escape the small towns and make their way to the exciting cities. You have their desires, but you also have the desires of the exhausted city dwellers, the office drones, who are dreaming, trying to recapture a simple life that they remember from their childhood, or maybe they only read about in books. But you have these two competing desires that are often present in American literature in the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century. We see it today in popular culture. Think of the context for Hey There, Delilah, or Uptown Funk, which are all about the excitement and the possibility and the freedom of living in the city. And then think about the context and the plot of Groundhog Day or any Hallmark Christmas movie or pretty much any country song. You have this tension also of about exhausted people looking to make meaningful connections that ground you to your community. So you have this drive for individuality and independence, and you have a drive for belonging and community. And those tensions, we see them throughout American literature. Access to education, which ties into class and gender and, of course, race. That education really defines the urban experience, or it's one of the defining factors of the urban experience, as we can see today in the fact that many urban Americans tend to define themselves by their jobs, by what they earn, by what they own. Yet at the same time, there's this tension for Americans to define themselves by their independence, by how well they can, survive on their own, how devoted they are to their ideals, their passions, their art, their personal connection to their heritage, their stewardship of the environment, or their involvement in sort of their family lives. These issues are not unique to any one race or a community in America, but I've kind of sort of used the Black American experience as a lens to talk about these issues. Simply because Black Americans and white Americans have historically approached these issues differently, because they're in general their experience is quite different, because of their the different connections that they have and the different understandings they have to these various issues and forces that I've tried to touch on. So I've chosen to focus on the Black experience in this lecture. Most of my students tend to be white, and they may sort of appreciate some extra background to understand the cultural context of the literary works by Black authors. And but the study of America's indigenous population and the legacy of the Spanish settlers in the Southwest, and Chinese immigrants in California, and Jewish refugees in New York and Chicago and so forth, these are also stories worthy of telling. And we can't really understand American literature unless we understand how these diverse groups interact with the stories of the descendants of European colonists and the white Europeans who joined them in later waves of immigration. This tension in the melting pot, the mixing bowl. But anytime I teach an American literature class, I'm likely to include several works by Black authors, because their influence is so clear and it's kind of easily traced in a course that has no literature prerequisites. I mean, really, the racial conflict in America is one of the defining factors in American literature. But this particular introduction to the big picture of American culture, it's focused on the Black experience, but it's just a sample. I hope for those who haven't taken the time to look at American history through this particular lens, that this overview will sort of help you recognize some of the themes that we're likely to encounter as we read works by diverse authors. And I hope that will give you a model for understanding how studying these tensions, how other kinds of forces, including forces about class and gender and other kinds of identity, how that can help us come up with questions to ask about the stories Americans have told each other about themselves. So, from the English department at Seton Hill University, I'm Dennis Jers saying happy reading.